this video, we'll start looking at square roots. This symbol is called a radical sign. A square root is looking for a number squared that equals the number under the radical. So for example, this asks for the square roots of 144. So I'm looking for what times itself or what squared is equal to 144. Notice this has an S on it. There's two answers here. 12 times 12, or 12 squared, is 144. So one answer would be 12. But also, negative 12 times negative 12, or negative 12 squared, is also a positive 144. So negative 12 is also the answer. So in your homework, you would enter the answer something like that. 12 comma negative 12. And the order doesn't matter. Now when we have that radical sign, it's just asking for the principal square root. That's what it's called. And the principal square root means just the positive square root. When we have this square root, or this radical, over a fraction, it's really asking us for the square root of the top number and the square root of the bottom number. So for the top number, we want to ask ourselves, what squared is 64? The answer is 8. 8 squared is 64. So I'd have an 8 on the top. And here I'm asking myself, what squared is 121? And the answer is 11. Now, there's also a square root button on your calculator. So you could just type the square root of 64 and you'll get 8. And then the square root of 121 and it will give you 11. In this problem, we have a radical of 9 and then a squared outside. This is a square root of 9 squared. When we have a square root and a squared, they cancel each other out. They're opposite operations. And so we end up here with just a plain old 9. So let me show you kind of if we worked it out without canceling it out. We'd start inside the parentheses, and the square root of 9 is 3, because 3 times 3 is 9. And then we want to square that 3, so we do 3 times 3, which is 9. Let's look at this one. This says 8 square root of 81. So this is really, when they're smashed together, it really means multiplication. So it's really saying 8 times the square root of 81. The square root of 81 is 9, because 9 times 9 is 81. So we'd have 8 times 9, which is 72. Now notice, once we take the square root, or once you type it into your calculator, when we write it, we don't write that square root any longer. We've done that operation. We've used the square root. So we just write the number without anything around it. In this problem, we have the square root of 256 plus 144. Because all of this is inside the square root, we need to do that first. It's like being inside the parentheses. So if we take 256 plus 144, we get 400. Now at this point, we have not done this square root yet, so it needs to stay on top. Then you could type in the square root of 400 into your calculator, and that gives us 20. Now we don't write the square root any longer now because we did the square root in our calculator. Now this is different. This says the square root of 36 plus the square root of 4. Those square roots are separate, so we're going to do them separately. So we do the square root of 36. and that is 6 because 6 times 6 is 36. And then we do the square root of 4, which is 2, because 2 times 2 is 4. And we keep that plus sign between them. Again, we're not writing the square root on these numbers here because we've already done the square root. The numbers have changed. So 6 plus 2 is 8. So this has a whole bunch of things inside the square root, and we're going to do them following the order of operations. So again, we're starting inside the square root because it's like being inside parentheses. But inside the square root, we have to do multiplication before subtraction. So we want to do this part first. So I'm going to copy everything else. And then I'm going to do 4 times 7 times negative 4 in my calculator. And that gives me a negative 112. Now this minus a negative really means positive. So I really have 144 plus 112. And that gives me the square root of 256. Now I'm ready to do the square root. I'm going to type square root of 256 into my calculator. And that gives me 16. Because I've typed the square root part, I've used it, I've done it, my number inside has changed, I don't write that root any longer. If a square root comes out evenly, it's called a rational number. If it does not come out evenly, if it's a decimal that does not end and does not repeat, it's called irrational or not rational. If the negative number is under the radical, inside the radical, then the answer is not a real number. So in this problem, it wants us to first of all tell if the square root is rational, irrational, or not a real number. If it's rational, we want to find the exact answer. If it's irrational, we want to write an approximate answer rounded to 2 decimal places. Okay, so the way we do this is we just type in the square root of 10 into our calculators. And you should get something like 3.162277766. Now your calculator may end there, but the decimal does not really end there. So because this is a long decimal, it keeps on going. It doesn't end. So this is an irrational number, which answers the first part of our question. Now if it's irrational, it wants us to give the answer rounded to 2 decimal places. So here's the second number after the decimal. The number after it is 4 or smaller, so that 6 stays the same, and we don't write the rest of the numbers after it. So we would have 3.16. Here's another same idea. Here we have a negative 100 underneath the radical. Now if you try typing the square root of negative 100 in your calculator, you will probably get an error message. Okay, the problem is that there is a negative number under the square root, and that means that this is not a real number. Now here the negative is outside, so we start with what's inside the square root. We do the square root. The square root of 36 is 6 because 6 times 6 is 36. And this negative out in front just stays out in front. So we get negative 6. Now that square root came out evenly, it came out nicely. So this is a rational number.